Now let's take a look at the demographics of psychology, at the representation of gender and racial minorities, both in the past and today. Historically, members of minority groups faced several challenges when trying to pursue a career in psychology. Minority members were often thought to be inferior to the majority group. Anti-Semitism directed at Jewish professionals made it more difficult for them to find work. Stereotypes about women and Black psychologists also made it difficult for them to find and keep work. Minority members were also banned from many of the communication networks that made it possible for students to become prominent psychologists. Remember that Edward Titchener prevented women from attending any of his special meetings. This was a problem because many of the early psychologists were friends or colleagues of Titchener's and attended these meetings. By not being allowed to attend these meetings, women were not able to make the same kinds of connections, weren't able to learn from others in the field. In 1968, Black psychologists banded together and created the Association of Black Psychologists as a way of opening the communication network to Black students and Black psychologists. Many of them were unable to secure full-time research-oriented teaching positions. If they were able to get a full-time job, it was often at a college established specifically for minority groups. To top it all off, minority members did not have the same resources. They did not have the same access to grants, to research labs, space, funding, equipment, and they often did not have graduate students to work with. Whether you're doing a survey or an experiment, it takes years, sometimes from start to finish. Graduate students can be a great help in that matter. Early female, Jewish, Black psychologists and professors did not have access to the same opportunities, to the same resources, which made it more difficult for them to succeed and to promote their work. Although minority members are not as represented today in psychology as we would like them to be, the APA has made several attempts over the years to create a climate that is more inclusive. For instance, in 1950, the APA passed a resolution that would prevent them from holding any of their important events, including its annual conference, in cities that practiced discrimination against minority groups. In 1968, several APA members were still not satisfied with the APA's efforts. They created the Association of Black Psychologists in the same year as a way of protesting the APA's lack of diversity and inclusivity. In the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, mostly because its members called for it, the APA created several subcommittees that were focused on increasing diversity and attracting minority members to the field. These subcommittees tried to better understand what it was like for minority members to join the field, to develop in their career, and to get jobs, to hold jobs, to publish. In 1974, the APA began to award financial aid to graduate students to help them pay for school. In the mid-1900s, we start to see the field of psychology diversify in all kinds of ways. We had multiple subdisciplines emerging. Remember, we've already talked about psychotherapy, behaviorism, humanistic psychology. We talked about clinical psychology, cognitive psychology, neuroscience, perceptual psychology, personality psychology. All of these different subdisciplines were beginning to emerge in the middle of the 1900s. Psychologists at the time had a variety of different interests. The research questions they asked were more diverse than ever. Their theories were diverse, everything from cognitive psychology to forensic psychology to school psychology. From our studies, we began to identify long lists of evidence based strategies that we could use in different industries and different settings. And finally, the representation of gender, racial, and religious minorities was finally beginning to increase. We were finally beginning to see the numbers change in a more positive direction. But as you know from the previous slide, many psychologists were still not entirely happy with the field and where we were in terms of diversity and inclusivity. Let's take a look at where we are today in terms of gender and racial representation. It's a little bit more difficult to find the representation of religious minorities because it isn't a question we often ask people. Thankfully, in 2016, women were better represented in psychology than they have ever been. Nearly 3/4 of undergraduate and graduate students in psychology are women. Slightly less than 1/2 of working PhDs are women. That number has quadrupled in the last 100 years. This graph illustrates that last point on the previous slide. In 2016, 65% of American psychologists were women. This includes those with master's degrees, PhDs, those working part-time, those working full-time. This is a big change from the beginning of the 1900s when there were just a handful of women studying psychology. Today, more than half of American psychologists are women. In 2016, racial minorities were still underrepresented. In 2010, one survey found that 23% of undergraduate psychology students in the United States were racial minorities. This number is up from an estimate in 1991 of 13%. In 2016, a study found that 16% of all psychologists in the United States were racial minorities. This number was also up from an estimate taken in 2007 at 9%. Here is an illustration of psychology's racial and ethnic composition. On the left, you see the breakdown for psychology. On the right, you see the breakdown for the entire country. You can see by comparing these two graphs that psychology's workforce is dominated by white psychologists. Only 61% of the US's workforce is white, identifies as white, but 84% of psychology's workforce identifies as white.